Hello, and welcome to the beginning of Module 6 in our summer online series in cognitive psychology, or cognition. So we're moving into discussing more everyday aspects of memory. In the last module, we spent a great deal of time discussing different types of encoding, different types of retrieval, how encoding and retrieval interact. In this module, we're going to first do an introduction to memory. Then we will move on and talk about source memory and source monitoring as an important part of applied memory. And we'll talk about what's called suggestibility and reconstructive processes in memory. Transition right into talking about applied cognition and memory in the courtroom. A very important topic. Then we will talk about metamemory and metacognition. Talk about ways in which we can apply what we've learned to studying and learning how to learn, and then we'll finish up with the discussion of autobiographical memory. So let's get started on a basic introduction to everyday memory. We'll start by talking about different types of memory errors, talk a little bit about memory for emotional events and how that might be a bit different from memory for other events, talk about what are called flashbulb memories, and really end up with the argument that they don't really exist, but people believe they exist, so that's one of the reasons we have to talk about them. We'll then start transitioning our way into the later topics on reconstructive memory by introducing a very classic bit of research by Frederic Bartlett using a Native American folk tale called The War of the Ghosts. And then that will transition us into talking about schemas and scripts, as schema and schemata as a part of memory are something that Bartlett introduced. So let's start with different types of memory errors. We've seen already, or thought already, of course, about what we call memory omission errors. And this is when you just forget something. You leave it out, so you omit it from memory. And in general, in the laboratory, of course, we would be talking about that you omitted it from the list of things you were supposed to remember. So it's a loss of memory. It could be due to the fact that you didn't encode it, or the fact that you couldn't retrieve it, or some combination thereof. But it's just simply something that you omitted or forgot. An error of commission is different. This is a memory error where we remember something, but we remember it incorrectly. Something like, oh, I remember hearing this on NBC News, when in fact you heard it on CNN. Minor error. Or you remember your friend Bob told you this when it was really your friend Larry. Something like that. Now we'll see that these can become much more serious as we start talking about different types of memorial processes. But these are different kinds of memory errors, and what we'll see is that you can actually remember things that never happened as being a true, genuine memory. And that's where we start to get into really some serious issues when we talk about things like eyewitness testimony. The final error I want to talk about, and this sort of projects us a little bit forward, and something we talked a little bit about in the neuropsychology lecture, is what we call a source monitoring error. And this is when you can correctly identify the content of a memory, what we would call the item memory, but not the source of the memory. That is the context in which the memory occurred. So this would be something like, we've talked about this a little bit in previous lectures, where you recognize somebody as being familiar, but can't remember where you know them from. That would be where you have a source monitoring error. You can't identify the correct source. Or you say, that guy's in my cognition class, when in actuality, he's in your human sexuality class. So you made a source monitoring error. I do this all the time in my classes, in that I think I told one class one thing, but I told the other class. Or I told the class a year ago. I can't remember where the source of that memory is. And we do this sort of thing all the time in just sort of our everyday lives. I'm sure every one of you has at some point been in the shower and can't remember if you washed your hair or not, or what you've washed or not. Or you leave the house and can't remember if you took your medication or not, because you can't monitor, you can't really identify the correct source of a memory. Is it from this morning, or was it from yesterday morning, or the morning before? Because they're all so similar, they all start to melt together. So we'll talk more about these later on. That gets us then for memory for emotional stimuli. So emotional events tend to be remembered more easily and more vividly. They tend to have a little bit more salient perceptual quality to them, or at least that's what people tell us. We believe emotion improves memory, and and it becomes greater with time. That is, it may enhance consolidation. That is, highly emotional experiences may be actually stored and consolidated in a much more meaningful, stronger way. Pick your descriptor there. So if you look at this particular study, we see emotionally arousing pictures versus neutral pictures. And in these studies, these are highly emotional arousing pictures. Actually, I would say emotionally upsetting pictures. But they have a great deal of arousal to them. They're just highly negatively arousing, emotionally arousing pictures versus neutral pictures. And people who are under in a stress induction condition versus no stress induction. And what you can see is these emotionally arousing pictures have much more memorial detail, and they're actually recalled better under stress than under no stress conditions. And still, even then, these emotional pictures are remembered better even under no stress. So, of course, the amygdala is the part of the brain that is primarily associated with our emotions, particularly our primal emotions. And it is, of course, very adjacent to, in fact, it's in the same system, it's in the limbic system as the hippocampus, which is, of course, what encodes all of our daily experiences. And so there's some belief that, of course, that close proximity and that close relationship may have something to do with this effect. We certainly see that in research studies. And we also see that stressful events are associated with the neurosteroid norepinephrine, and that norepinephrine has certainly been associated with increased consolidation of memories, and in fact what you get is increased long-term potentiation and increased memory for items under that sort of activity with that norepinephrine. So that's a really important thing to think about. I do want to insert something we'll talk a little bit about later on, and that's the role of attention in encoding into long-term memory is particularly important, because one of the things that happens is things that capture our attention are the things that we encode best. And in simple list learning exercises, we do things like look at how attention capture occurs with emotional words or with just unusual words, and we see that those words are remembered better. In these highly emotionally arousing pictures we see, they are also associated with a greater amount of attentional capture. One of the things that happens in more real-life experiences is our attention will focus on whatever is threatening to us. Our attentional networks are designed to warn us about a dangerous activity. That's why anything moving is automatically attended to. Well, in what's called the weapon focus effect, we have a tendency to attend to a weapon during a crime. So if there is a weapon present in a crime that somebody witnesses, there is a good chance that their memory for the faces of people committing the crimes will be greatly reduced because all of their attention will have been focused on that weapon. And there's a lot of research showing that this is pretty prominent. And in fact, when we talk about eyewitness memory in a later part of this module, we'll see that the New Jersey State Supreme Court and the U.S. Department of Justice have started looking at how eyewitness memory may differ because of the presence of a weapon. And I think it's a really important thing to consider because it really does alter our memory for the experience. So that's a little discussion of emotional memory that gets us right into talking about what are called flashbulb memories. So flashbulb memories, the idea kind of came into existence almost all on its own. Certainly not based on necessarily on research. It sort of became its own myth. The earliest accounts that I've read about flashbulb memories really start with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and then really take on a cultural sort of magnitude, I guess is the word I'm looking for, after the Kennedy assassination. And the idea behind a flashbulb memory is that something is so surprising and traumatizing, or potentially traumatizing, or emotional, I guess is the best word. Something is so surprising and so emotional that it's like a flashbulb goes off, and so flash goes off on your camera and you imprint time and space and what's happening around you into a highly detailed account of your memory at the time. And probably your grandparents, my parents, your grandparents' generation, depending on how old you are, certainly there was a lot of discussion of where were you when you found out that Kennedy was assassinated. And there was some of that when Lincoln was assassinated. Then, if we fast forward to the 1980s, in 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded as millions of school children were watching it take off because Terry McAuliffe was the first teacher in space. And so we see with the Challenger incident an opportunity, certainly Ulrich Neisser saw an opportunity to try to study this kind of flashbulb memory for surprising, highly emotionally charged, important events. So he did some research. In addition to his research on the Space Shuttle Challenger in the United Kingdom, there was similar research done surrounding Princess Diana's death. And then, of course, in the United States, 9/11 is another part of this research tradition. And that actually has really allowed us, the studies of 9/11 have really advanced how this idea has come about and why it is an illusion. That is, this idea that we have this highly detailed memory is really an illusion. And it gets at these things like where were you, what were you doing at the time, and that's really what these research studies are about. In the moment or the day after, very soon, they get in, ask people, where were you doing, what were you doing, what do you remember? And then they come back to them a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, sometimes 10 years later to see what they can find out. So that's what we're going to look at are these highly emotional, vivid, and theoretically very detailed memories to see whether or not they're accurate. And we'll actually find that they're not. So the idea is, of course, that this is some sort of photographic memory or eidetic memory, which there's some question about whether it exists. One of the things we see with this kind of memory is people tell the story so often that it gets repeated over and over again. And one of the things we see is that when you retrieve a memory, you open it back up with the potential that it can be overwritten again. So you want to be very cautious about that kind of repeated recall. So what we see in these studies is we get an initial description or baseline, and then of course we get later reports that are compared to baseline in all of these studies. This figure on the right is, of course, the Space Shuttle Challenger, and this is Neisser and Harsh's classic study on people's memories for the day they heard about the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. So, results suggest that these memories can be quite inaccurate or lacking in detail, but participants report that they were very confident and that the memories seemed very vivid. So what we see is the further we get away from the event, the lower our actual memories get. So here on the left, we have details for everyday memories and the flashbulb memory. And you can see the details pretty much have the same level of decline over time. Belief in the strength of the memories, though, declines for everyday memories, but doesn't really change all that much for the supposed flashbulb memory. And that's a really important thing to consider. So what they've done here in these ratings on the right is asked a meta-memory judgment. How confident are you in that memory? How vivid is that memory? How strong is that memory? So this is a way in which we can get at the phenomenological quality of what people believe about their memories. And we're going to get into that here in a later bit in this module. One of the things we know from laboratory research is that emotion can disrupt memory for contextual detail. And in fact, in this particular study, the authors were looking at these, what we call remember responses or recollective responses, where people can provide the exact, that is, they describe themselves as being able to remember all of the detail. That is, they believe that they can remember the context around which they remember the item. And so what they did is they studied these negative pictures, like this one, versus neutral pictures, like these. And what we see, and then they had this border. And they were supposed to look at the picture and also try to identify the picture with its correct border. So these are the remember responses for negative pictures versus neutral pictures, which means that these people say they remember more detail. But you can see that they're actually able to correctly identify the color of the border better for neutral pictures. This gets right back at what I was just saying, is that these highly negative pictures that you see here are, particularly this one, are disrupting attention because they're capturing so much attention that we are unable to encode the context, or we're not encoding the context because we're so focused on that highly emotional part of that picture. And that's an important part of understanding how emotion can disrupt memory for context. So the memory, they believe the memory for the details of this event, or these pictures, were better, but in fact they were so focused on the negative aspect of the emotional pictures that everything else got tossed aside. So part of this question about flashbulb memories is, why do we believe that they are so important? Why do we think that they're so vivid? Part of it is this idea of what we call the narrative rehearsal process. And we tell stories. In fact, stories are an important part of how our memories work and our sense of identity. In fact, we're kind of going to bookend this module on everyday memory with talking about what's called the narrative self. And our stories are part of our autobiographical memory. And so this repeated viewing, hearing about an event, reading about the event, talking with others about the event, we start to get part of this narrative process that we rehearse over and over again. And each time we do that, we can introduce new errors. And in fact, there's a classic paper where investigators went back and looked at President Bush's public remarks about 9/11 and found that he started incorporating some incorrect details over time because he was sort of creating this change in narrative self. And there have been a number of instances recently where people have gotten in sort of trouble for saying things that weren't true, but they believed to be true. So there's a famous news anchor that got in trouble for this, that his account of some event during a war sort of changed over time. And what I think happened, I don't think he was trying to lie. I think each time he told the story, a detail got added or subtracted, and his memory for that story changed over time. And that was what his recollection was. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We can't treat people harshly because their memory isn't what we expect it to be, because frankly, all of our memories are pretty terrible and pretty hard to believe. So that's something to keep in mind. That gets us right at what we call the War of the Ghosts study. So in 1932, Frederic Bartlett published a seminal work called Remembering, a study in experimental and social psychology. And in this seminal work, he proposed several key ideas, including what we call the constructivist nature of memory. And a little later in this module, we're going to talk about reconstructive processes in memory. And in fact, our modern view of memory is that of a constructivist or reconstructivist nature. And so Bartlett was way ahead of his time in his views on memory. And in fact, a lot of this wasn't particularly well embraced at the time. But this seminal work is particularly important, and it talks about the influence of what we call schemas on memory and behavior. So I want to take you through this particular study and why I think it's so interesting and something that definitely we should consider as an important work in psychology and in particular cognition. So in Cambridge, England, Bartlett had participants read the Native American folktale, The War of the Ghosts, and they read through it twice. I have not read this particular folktale, but apparently its logic structure is a little difficult to follow. There are lots of supernatural elements. There are lots of things that would be foreign, particularly to participants in Cambridge in 1932. Excuse me. The participants then reproduced the story from memory, often several times over different intervals, and even sometimes up to years later. So it started about 15 minutes later, and then kind of went on. In another condition, he used a serial reproduction method, and this is one I found really interesting. I only recently read about this part of this study. So what he did is he had one person would read the story twice, and then they would recall it. And then the next person would read what they wrote, and then they would recall the story, and so on. Sort of like that game of telephone where you sort of say something, and as it goes around the room, it completely changes meaning. And if really, of course, not surprisingly, but interestingly, the story changed over time. And in both instances, the story changed even within one person rewriting the story or between people, people sort of writing another person's version. It became more English. So things like canoe became a boat, seal hunting became fishing. It had more structure, more logical structure to it, more narrative structure. And what Bartlett believed was that participants were constructing the story based on their knowledge and cultural views, their schemas. Bartlett was interested in being an anthropologist, and turns out he was a really great psychologist because he was willing to think about things like culture and our upbringing and how it might affect how we process information and how we retrieve information. And that's how he came up with this idea of schema. And so what they were doing is that they weren't remembering the story as it was told. They were remembering the story as it related to the things that they already knew. So they were using their knowledge to structure the story. You can think of a schema, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, but you can think of a schema as sort of a cognitive architecture. So around which you can sort of build your memory. Think of it like if you had a frame around a house, and then what you fill that frame with depends on you, but that frame is going to determine what the house looks like. It's the same kind of idea. So that gets us at schemas and scripts. A schema is a cognitive framework or concept that helps organize and interpret information. So basic sort of schema is something like, what do I know about going to the grocery store? What do I know about going to a restaurant? You have a basic idea about how that goes and what that's about. Related to that is a script. A script is a predetermined stereotyped sequence of actions that defines a well-known situation. So you might have a schema about going out to a restaurant, and then the script is what you would follow when you got there. You go up to the host or hostess, they would seat you, someone will bring you some water, tell you about the specials, they will come back with your drinks, they'll then and bread, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So this is sort of a predetermined stereotyped sequence of actions. When places like Chipotle first opened, people were used to Chipotle and even Subway. They're used to walking up to the McDonald's window and saying, I'd like X, Y, or Z, and then going from there. Of course, Chipotle, you start with, I would like a bowl or a burrito, and then you have to sort of build it yourself. And that was an unusual model. In fact, I've known people that when they first opened in South Carolina that would walk in and walk back out because they couldn't figure out how to do it. So whenever you violate this kind of script or schema, you actually can have some difficulty because these are culturally derived expectations about how to behave, and you have them. Everyone has a schema about the way an academic semester goes. The first day of the semester, you're going to get the syllabus and maybe a little bit of discussion. If there's a full lecture, you're going to be really irritated because you know you have this expectation that that's not how that's going to work. And then there's sort of a basic rhythm and way in which class is conducted, the way in which all of that goes. And so you just have this basic idea about how this all works. And that's what we use to both encode information and retrieve it. It's sort of what we hang everything on. So schemas guide our encoding and retrieval of memories for scenes and events. And we'll talk about a couple of quick studies. And this will come up in a couple of areas as we go through this module. But Brewer and Trains found participants remembered items consistent with an office more than sort of usual items not found in an office. So things like a wrench or a brick. So anything that was supposed to be in an office, they remembered well. Also, really unusual things were remembered well. So there was a human skull, and that was everyone remembered the skull. Critically, they often recalled things that weren't in the office but were consistent with the scene. So for example, there were no books in the office, but they recalled seeing books. And so there have been a number of these studies, things like somebody tells a story about going to the dentist, and there's no mention of, Highlights Magazine anywhere in there, but somehow that gets added back into the story because that's part of your schema. This likely indicates a couple of things. One, that highly surprising items capture more attention at encoding. So that's not at all surprising, something we've just been talking about. And while retrieving memories of items which were expected but not present, that's occurring because we have an expectation about what's in an office, and we're using that expectation more than we are the actual memorial experience. All right, we're going to pick up on source memory and source monitoring in our next lecture. Thank you very much.